Thank you. I'll be giving you a bit of an introduction on this topic, but I'll also highlight some of the concepts because I believe not everybody in the room might be familiar with some of them. So, rough outline. As I said, I'll explain some of the concepts, then have a brief look at the actual locations where the research was conducted, go on to the analysis, and then, because this is still very much a project in progress, see where this is possibly going to take us. Now, the whole project started off actually from a RAP project in 2014 that I conducted together with Nikki Puckey. And we had two research students, or RAP students I should say, who we sent off to investigate Southampton and Winchester in relation to what in sociolinguistics is known as linguistic landscapes. Now, linguistic landscapes is a term that kind of became popular in research roughly 10 years ago. This is a definition from one of the earliest publications on this. So language is all around us in textual form as it is displayed on shop windows, commercial signs, posters, official notices, traffic signs, etc. Most of the time, people do not pay much attention to the linguistic landscape that surrounds them. We all walk past these notices. We don't generally notice them, but they caught the eye of sociolinguists. So any of these signage items in the public domain we generally refer to as linguistic landscapes. As Garta then goes on to say, on the one hand, it is the literal study of the languages as they are used in the signs, and on the other hand, also the representation of the languages, which is of particular importance because it relates to identity and cultural globalization, to the growing presence of English, and to the revitalization of minority languages. So in one branch of linguistic landscape research, we still have very much this idea of how much multilingualism is present, whether that is official multilingualism, if you like, so for example in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, where there are multiple languages present and very visible, but also growing presence of English, so the spread of English, whether that's due to advertising or similar aspects, and more recently also visibility of minority languages, which then contributes to their revitalization, so an increasing usage and also an increase in speaker numbers. One example where it was fairly obvious how this can work in the opposite direction was the invasion of the Crimea, and all of a sudden the Russians taking down signage that Tatar speakers had put up and replacing them with Russian signs only. So we can see all sorts of political, historical, and also social relationships in how this is signed in the public sphere. Now, to give you an idea of what that can look like, the Middle East is one of the favorite places, in addition to Southeast Asia, to look at this. And you can see history and politics played out on signage there. This is in Jerusalem. It's one of the old street signs on the Jaffa Gate, so one of the entrances to the old city. Those tile designs are pretty much the standard, and as you can see, it's quite worn. So this is actually a sign that goes back to British Mandate times, so early 20th century. As you can see, English is right at the top, so that is the #1 language at the time because of the people who are in charge. Next one down is Arabic, because that's who the ruling party or the rulers at the time saw as more important, and then Hebrew comes last, because that's at the time the least important language. So you can see political and social status played out on the street signs which date back to the 1940s. If you look at more contemporary signs, also again, Jerusalem, a couple of streets away, you see a very different design. You have similar tiling patterns, but you have all of a sudden Hebrew at the top, set off with a border, then Arabic, then English, or a transliteration. Now, these signs are typical for originally the period 1948 to 67, so until the start of the Six-Day War, when Jerusalem was under Jordanian control. That's why Arabic is there at the top, followed by English or the transliteration. And then when Israel took on the Old City again, they added the box at the top with the Hebrew signage to then also show, hold on, this is ours again. So you do still find tiles in that format, those street signs. They've been increasingly replaced by the less historically obvious ones. Same kind of idea, still the same order of languages, but minus the border. That indicates there used to be a different kind of political reality in place. And then you also see catering, for example, to tourism. This is one of the kind of standard restaurant signs. You have it in English and in Arabic only. So again, making a clear statement, this is catering to the locals, but also the tourists in part of the Old City, which is not generally associated with being heavily populated by Jewish populations. So you can see politics, history, but also tourism played out in signage. Now, another aspect, sorry, this is going to be a bit theoretical in the first part, is the concept of superdiversity. This is something we as sociolinguists have borrowed from migration studies. It's actually something that has a fancy term for something that's pretty obvious to most of us. Populations aren't necessarily stable. We have people moving in and out, and as Vertovec, who pretty much coined the term, said, superdiversity comes as a result of transformative diversification of diversity, not just in terms of ethnicities and countries of origin, but also with respect to a variety of significant variables that affect where, how, and with whom people live. So ethnic migration studies uses this term to effectively describe very much urban scenarios where we have diverse populations living with each other, so not necessarily a distribution according to ethnicities in certain parts of town, but more of a mixing. Now, as I said, this is a term which describes something that is actually pretty obvious. In sociolinguistics, there are kind of two streams. One stream of sociolinguists who are working on superdiversity really buy into this. The others see it as rather fanciful naming of things that we do and have done for a very long time, which involves research on multilingualism, community languages, community cohesion, to some extent education policies, etc. So there's a bit of controversy surrounding that term in the sense that some people think it's a bit over the top and just a fancy term. Now, what I want to do in the project that I'm working on there currently is bring together linguistic landscapes, superdiversity, however critical you might want to view that term, heritage and indexicality. Now, heritage is obviously a problematic term. If we look at it from A definition perspective again, it's about preservation or exploitation of local and national features of historical, cultural or scenic interest, also referring to tourist attractions. That already gives us kind of an agenda of what heritage and heritage industry might do. So it's a part of industry which might have certain priorities of what is marketable and what isn't. Now, as Moore says, cities are not just blank canvases on which you can write stories. They remain connected to the past, and that past and what she calls the landscape there is also the history of the people and the memory. So it's this particular aspect that I'm interested in relation to Winchester and Southampton. So I'm using linguistic landscapes in a slightly different aspect. I'm not so much looking at the signs in the public sphere, but I'm taking a look at how the heritage is represented in museums, who's represented, to some extent also what languages are represented in there. So I'm taking a slightly different route on this. For those of you who are not familiar with indexicality and enregisterment, and I promise this is the last definition you get to see, indexicality is about meaning and how meanings co-occur. Also social meaning that is carried by linguistic variables. So again, it's a concept that goes back quite a far way. Labov hints at it in one of his earliest publications, Sociolinguistic Patterns, in 1972. Bell picks it up. One of the names that's most associated with it is linguistic anthropologist Michael Silverstein. Barbara Johnston has done a lot of work on indexicality in relation to Pittsburghese and the Yinzers, as the local population refer to themselves. So with this, we generally look at orders of indexicality. So without going into too much detail, first order indexicality generally refers to features that can be linguistic or otherwise that are present in a particular demographic group, but they are not necessarily on the forefront of their mind. They'll be visible or audible, if you like, to linguists, people who specialize in investigating these groups. Hence, they're also known as indicators. Second order indexicality, much more obvious. These are norms which define the speech community. Also, in that case, the feature is enregistered, so people will notice it. Generally, the in-group will notice them. It's also affected by linguistic ideologies, so there'll be connections to, oh, this is how I notice how somebody speaks more correctly than somebody else. This is how I notice somebody's working class or somebody is local. So if you like, those are local identity markers. Third order indexicality are usually features that are used to perform identity explicitly, then known as stereotypes. Very often used in a humorous way, both by group insiders as well as outsiders. So if you like, you can see those as a gradual increase in visibility. So going from experts to lay people, and then using different layers of it to reinforce identity or to change identity. Also, obviously, then features can fall out of use because they become overly marked and therefore meaningless. Okay, so what has all of this got to do with Winchester and Southampton? We picked the two cities initially for the RAP project because A, they're local, and B, they have some interesting parallels. Obviously, demographically speaking, size-wise, they're not really comparable. Southampton is miles bigger than Winchester. If we're looking just at the city wards, Winchester is just under 40,000 people in 2011 on the census. Southampton, close to 240,000. So massive size difference. However, they share certain features in their makeup, if you like. So both of them have a certain amount of military history, albeit a very different one. Both of them have certain features that work for heritage and the heritage industry. And then obviously there's a certain amount of business and industry, including hospitals, universities, on a different scale. So we try to establish as much as possible where they are comparable, but also where they're different. Now, Southampton was strategically important during the Second World War, thus experienced a lot of bombing from my fellow countrymen. The docks have always been commercially significant. I'm sure you're all aware of the whole history surrounding Titanic. That will feature in the analysis quite heavily. As I said, it's important, but it wasn't as important as Portsmouth, for example. So, yes, important, but not quite as prominent as some others. Commercially speaking, Southampton is much more important than Winchester. Based on the size, obviously you have several shopping centres, which then also means you see different types of shops round about the city. So you see by far more of the large chains, etc., whereas Winchester tends to have more the smaller independent shops to a large extent. Now, also what we looked at to give us a bit more of a background was property prices. Winchester, obviously quite expensive, so more oriented towards Surrey, London prices. Southampton, much cheaper. Winchester, obviously old capital of England. You have the excavations relating to Alfred the Great, which the university was involved in and featured quite prominently in the news. So there's a different type of heritage that's being marketed as well. And we will see that shortly. So that's the background to the locations. What we then looked at to some extent was this idea of superdiversity. How diverse is the landscape? What functions does superdiversity fulfill? Is it indexed in any way? And based on the material that we had, we largely found these four functions or features, if you like: education, commerce, marketing, and advertising. So we had images that related to multilingualism, especially around the university, welcome week, educational material that's visible, language courses that are being offered. So again, you could see flyers and windows, but then also a certain amount of advertising and marketing. None of these are really surprising. Those are the kind of typical functions of superdiversity in the linguistic landscape. We did find a little bit of evidence in Winchester, but more of that in Southampton, where the signage indicated in-group membership. So services aimed specifically at particular population groups. So for example, there were ads for car mechanics in Polish, posted in a shop window of a Polish deli. We found those both in Winchester and Southampton. So these are really then aimed at the in-group that speaks this particular language. Again, not very surprising. If we contrast that with what we refer to as prestige and authenticity, it's a very different picture. Again, none of it unusual, if you like, but you walk around and you see a French name for a French restaurant. You see an Italian restaurant name. This isn't an indication of super diversity. This is really just catering to authenticity. So your pizzeria can only be called Italian if it has an Italian name. So it's the selling function in this respect. It's also what we refer to as emblematic usage, based on what Agathe and Silverstein have explained. We termed it superficial super diversity because it's really only on the surface. There is no underlying engagement with the language or the group who speak it. It's just there for marketing purposes or prestige. If we look at cultural activities, in this case we looked at heritage tourism. We had our students do the data collection around about the time of the Hat Fair. So we found a few flyers that were very clearly aimed again at tourism in the widest sense. And again, it was largely French titles, Italian titles, or similar, to convey an air of authenticity. So the shows were definitely not in French or Italian. They just had the title to make it look authentic. So again, very much the superficial engagement only. Okay, now for the interesting bits with the photos. So when we looked at heritage in Winchester, we found that we're largely looking at heritage of the actual place. So you have images dotted round about. This is kind of material that's typical for linguistic landscapes in the traditional sense. We have a trilingual sign in English, German and French, explaining all about the Alfred statue. So this is catering to the traditional tourism market using the major languages you would expect to see. Very much your typical tourism image, very much also focused on particular buildings, statues or places, such as, in this case, the statue itself. Here, one of the explanatory leaflets up at Westgate Museum, entirely in French. You could also get it in Dutch, one of the smaller languages that we didn't necessarily expect to see. And again, catering entirely for explaining the history of Winchester itself. Not really anything to do with the people, only focused on edifices of some sort. Also, the explanation there for the Westgate itself, the Dutch one here. So we have the heritage aspect clearly visible in the architecture and the buildings. Southampton has comparatively little in that respect due to the Second World War and the bombing. So on the heritage of place, Winchester clearly wins. We have the typical tourism languages that you would expect to see, so the big ones. Slightly surprising, some of the smaller ones, as I said, Dutch, which we didn't really expect to see. There is the occasional one that you find for Russian, but again, comparatively few examples of that. We haven't quantified it yet. I don't think the quantification on places like this will lead to very much in comparison to much bigger cities where more attractions yield more interesting results, quantitatively speaking. If we look at the military history in Winchester, it's quite interesting in the sense that in the museum just over in the barracks, you do find evidence of actual artifacts in different languages. This map from the First World War in German, here in Malay, a poster for people who are wanted, and then this was a map for Afghanistan, if I can see that correctly. Yeah. Here we would have expected to see a little bit more in the way of the people involved in the history and the heritage, but again, we didn't see that at all. Again, it's catering to heritage of what we refer to as heritage of place. So it's the association between the military and Winchester. Nothing to do with the people who are involved in the place at all. Nothing really in the way of catering for tourists in different languages. This is largely aimed at English speakers or people who are proficient as English speakers in that respect. Now, this is where the students collected the data for us. With their brief, anything that was publicly accessible, i.e. where you didn't have to pay an entrance fee. Which unfortunately meant that in Southampton, they missed out on the one thing that gave us the extra bit of information that then made it so different. And that is the Sea City Museum. So the Sea City Museum was opened in 2002. It has got 2 permanent exhibitions. That's the Titanic one and the so-called Gateway to the World. As I said, unlike the Winchester attractions, it's not free. You have to pay an entrance fee. It's also not as established yet. It's only been open a few years. There's a bit of controversy surrounding the museum in the sense that Southampton had to sell part of its art collection to finance the museum. So that was a very controversial decision at the time. The pieces of art that were sold weren't publicly accessible, so nobody really would have noticed them not being on display, but it caused a lot of outcry at the time. Also, the problem with the museum to this day is largely running at a loss. So it's, as I said, it's not an uncontroversial attraction. Unlike Winchester, it portrays a very different story of heritage and people, though. The Titanic exhibition is largely focused on people and the people working on the Titanic. So not really anything about passengers or how much work was involved or what kind of prestige it brought to Southampton until the infamous iceberg. But you see plenty of images like this. These are just 2 that I picked, 2 people that I picked at random. It's all about the people involved behind the scenes. It also only tells you about the story of the crew, and it makes it very explicit how much of an impact the people had on the place. So one of the most interesting displays is one that is possibly not very much noticed, comes towards the end of the exhibition, where you see a map of Southampton with a red dot for each crew member who died and where they lived in the city. It's actually quite big. I couldn't get it all into the shot. So Southampton very much plays on the idea, okay, we might not have the heritage, we might not have the long history that Winchester has, but we have the people who made history one way or another. The second part of the exhibition is the so-called Gateway to the World, and this is very much the local side of the history that's displayed. The subtitle for that is 200,000 Years of Seafaring. So again, it uses Southampton as a staging point to then show what the people have achieved, those who came back or those who got attracted to Southampton. So in this case, it's not the place that's important, it's the actual location. So you have, again, picked at random, parts of the exhibition follow effectively individuals around who came to Southampton from elsewhere across time. So you have, in this case, a weaver from Flanders. Interestingly, here we also then find, and this is throughout the entire exhibition, what languages they brought with them. So Southampton very explicitly refers to, if you like, superdiversity at different times of its history. But it's not just individuals, it's also groups that are mentioned who might have left because via Southampton. So immigrants, again, who were they? What languages did they speak? Also then, how much time did they spend? What might they have contributed to the city at the time? So even though these people might not have left much of a permanent mark, the temporary mark that they have left in the history is represented in this exhibition. Interestingly, there was a special exhibition on detailing immigration into Southampton, mainly in the 20th century, and focusing on most of the, if you like, typical immigrant groups to the UK. Again, picked at random here, the Caribbean display, which again highlights where people came from, what they brought, where they worked, and what their story in the city is. So have they settled? Have the children stayed? Where are they working now? To some extent, where possible, those exhibits are again following individuals. So we have very much a people-focused display again here. And then one of the interesting ones is a huge wall display where they explicitly highlight that everybody makes up this story. So it's not just the faceless individuals that we sometimes have with Winchester because they're part of the military. Again, we have people who can actually add to the story. You can actually key in where you have come from and how this is part of your story. So this is very much the interactive part of this, where the museum asks people to become involved and to be part of the story. As you can see there, we're all part of the Southampton story. Might be seen as slightly kitschy, but from the perspective of comparison to Winchester, it's a total polar opposite. So it plays very much also with the Titanic story on this idea of we don't care what your job was. We don't care whether you were an important king or not. You're part of our fabric. So very much trying to ignore any kind of class divides, ethnic divides or anything else. So at least it comes across as a by far more egalitarian representation of the population. Whether that is played out in reality is obviously a very different question. Certainly it seems to be the case that the media doesn't quite see it like that. In 2015, if I remember correctly, and I think it was Channel 4, tried to do a reimagining, if you like, of Benefit Street that focused on Southampton, called Immigration Street. It ran to all of one episode, had to be abandoned because the people who took part, who were all living on the same road, basically kicked up a massive big stink, saying they weren't represented properly. The program had to be scrapped. From a research perspective, ethically, the research that the broadcasters did was not sound. They certainly, from what you can see in the program, did not treat their participants with any kind of respect. It's a very much an unfairly represented population. And you can see that played out throughout the program, where you can see the tensions if you look closely. So clearly in that program, the participants didn't feel like their background was anything that was worthwhile reporting on. They just happened to be there, and they just happened to be who they are. And the fact that Derby Road is very much multicultural, multilingual, didn't seem to bother them as much as it seemed to, as much as the production companies seemed to think it might be worthwhile reporting on. Okay, so where does this leave us? Heritage in Winchester and Southampton is traditional in the sense that it caters for the same types of tourists in the way that languages are used on information materials. What is very different is the representation or the presentation of heritage. So, as I said, Winchester is the heritage of the place. What the place is about, what it has achieved, whereas Southampton is very much an idea of the heritage of the location, of the people, where they went, where they came from, what they contributed, rather than a faceless mask. What I haven't managed yet to do is a look at the respective walking tours that are available, because both Southampton and Winchester offer them. Winchester's more recent edition is the Jewish walking tour, where you can follow the some of the stations around where the Jewish population in the Middle Ages lived, which, based on the leaflet that I've seen so far, seems to be very much more focused on the individuals rather than the group as a whole. I haven't looked into the ones in Southampton yet, but from what I have seen from the leaflets there, it seems to be the case that the walking tours in Southampton do what we would expect to see in Winchester. It's taking you around some of the buildings that still exist to tell you the story of the place. So, as I said, there's still some work to be done on that level, and I think the outcome for that might be the case that the two swap sides, so to speak. Yeah, so that is kind of an idea of a very different type of linguistic landscape, which goes away from the traditional definition that we had, but equally looking at the people who are using the language and what mark they might leave in the story of the place, because the idea that heritage is people's memories and people's stories clearly is connected to language, so I think it's worthwhile calling these linguistic landscapes as well. Maybe eventually renaming them to landscapes of memory or storytelling, if you like, but we'll leave that definition dilemma for another day, I would say. Any questions?